Imagine being told you no longer exist, that your name, your past, and your future have been erased, and you are now the property of a powerful, secret organization that can torture and kill your family at any moment. For 7 years, this was the terrifying reality for Colleen Stan after she accepted a ride from a seemingly harmless young couple. Kept for up to 23 hours a day in a box the size of a coffin, her prison wasn't just physical. It was a cage built inside her own mind, a web of lies so powerful it could keep her captive even when no locks were turned. This is the chilling true story of The Girl in the Box, a journey into the mind of a sadistic manipulator and the incredible resilience of a woman who had to die to survive. Welcome to the Dark Chapters. May 19, 1977. It was a bright, hopeful spring day in Northern California. The kind of day that feels full of promise, where the warmth of the sun makes the world seem safe. For 20-year-old Colleen Stan, it was a perfect day for a road trip. She was on her way from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's surprise birthday party in a small town a few hundred miles south. An experienced hitchhiker, she had thumbed her way across the state before without incident. In the freewheeling culture of the 1970s, it was a common way for young people to travel. It was an act of trust, a belief in the inherent goodness of strangers. Standing by the side of the road that day, with her backpack and a hopeful smile, Colleen had no reason to believe her faith was misplaced. It was a decision made in the innocence of a sunlit afternoon, a decision that would plunge her into a 7-year nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. She didn't have to wait long. A clean-looking blue van pulled over. Inside was a young couple who seemed utterly harmless. The man behind the wheel, Cameron Hooker, was lanky with longish hair. Beside him, his wife, Janice, was quiet and unassuming. But it was the sight in the back that sealed Colleen's trust completely. A baby, strapped securely into a car seat. To Colleen, a baby was the ultimate symbol of safety. No one with a child could possibly mean her any harm. It was a sign from the universe that this was a good ride, a safe ride. Relieved, she accepted their offer, tossed her backpack in the back, and climbed in. The van pulled back onto the interstate, and as the miles began to pass, Colleen relaxed. The conversation was light and friendly. They talked about where she was going, about the baby, about the weather. It all felt so normal, so reassuringly mundane. For about an hour, the journey was uneventful. But then Cameron Hooker made a turn. He pulled off the main highway and onto a quiet, deserted dirt road flanked by dense woods. He told Colleen they just wanted to show her a scenic spot, a local hot spring. A flicker of unease, the first prickle of fear, went through Colleen. This wasn't right. The friendly atmosphere in the van evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. The mask of normalcy had dropped. Suddenly, Cameron stopped the van. He turned to her, and the friendly man from the highway was gone. In his place was a cold, menacing predator. He held up a knife, its blade glinting in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The threat was unspoken but absolute. Janice, his wife, remained silent, her face a blank mask. Colleen was frozen in terror, her mind struggling to comprehend the sudden, violent shift in reality. Her world, which had been so bright and safe just moments before, had become a trap. Before she could even scream, Cameron forced a large, heavy, bizarrely constructed wooden box over her head. It wasn't just a box. It was a sensory deprivation device designed with terrifying precision. It was lined with foam, completely blocking out all light and sound. It pressed down on her shoulders, locking her head in place, instantly plunging her into a suffocating world of blackness and silence. Her senses, her connection to the world, were violently severed. All she could feel was the weight of the box, the pounding of her own heart, and the paralyzing grip of pure terror. She was blind, she was deafened, she was helpless. This was the beginning of the psychological torture, a method designed to break her spirit before she even knew what was happening. She could feel the van start to move again, taking her deeper into the unknown. Disoriented and trapped within her wooden prison, she lost all sense of time and direction. Hours bled into one another in the silent darkness. Her life, her friends, the birthday party, the sunshine. It was all part of a world that no longer existed for her. Her reality had shrunk to the size of the suffocating box around her head. When the van finally stopped, she was led, stumbling, out of the vehicle and into a house. It was the Hooker's home in Red Bluff, California, a small, unassuming house on a quiet suburban street. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from any other family home, but inside it was to be her prison. She was led down a set of stairs into a dark, musty basement. It was here that the true horror of her situation began to unfold. That day, the day she was taken, did not end with the physical abduction. It ended with the beginning of her 7 years of enslavement. Cameron Hooker, a man with a twisted and depraved imagination, presented her with a contract. He told her he was part of a powerful, shadowy organization known only as the Company. He explained that they had chosen her, that they owned her now, and that her life was in their hands. The contract stipulated that she was now his slave, property to be used however he saw fit. He warned her that the Company was everywhere. They were watching her family, her friends. If she ever tried to escape, if she ever disobeyed, they would not only torture and kill her, but they would go after everyone she had ever loved. To a terrified, disoriented 20-year-old girl, cut off from everything she knew, the threat felt terrifyingly real. The contract, the story of the Company, it was an elaborate fiction, a psychological cage constructed to ensure her complete and total obedience. On May 19, 1977, Colleen Stan was not just kidnapped. Her very identity was being systematically erased, replaced by the role of a slave trapped in a basement, in a strange house. Under the control of a depraved couple, her old life was over. An unimaginable new reality, one of darkness, silence, and absolute servitude, had just begun. The basement of the Hooker house in Red Bluff became Colleen Stan's entire world. It was a dim, damp space that smelled of earth, mildew, and decay. But it was not the basement itself that was her prison. It was the box. Cameron Hooker had designed and built his primary instrument of torture with a chilling and meticulous ingenuity. It was not simply a container, it was an engine of psychological warfare constructed to methodically dismantle a human being. Roughly the size of a coffin, but cruelly narrower to restrict any meaningful movement. Its interior was a space of absolute annihilation. When the two heavy padlocked hasps were secured, it became a void where sound, light, and hope could not penetrate. This box was where Colleen would spend the vast majority of her time for the next several years, up to 23 hours a day, in a state of living death. Her days, if they could be called that, bled into a monotonous, hellish cycle of torment and deprivation. Time ceased to have any meaning. There was no sunrise, no sunset, no differentiation between noon and midnight. There was only the suffocating, unchanging darkness of her confinement. She was let out only for brief, terrifying intervals, and these moments were no reprieve. They were an escalation of the horror. Cameron would unlock the box, his shadow falling over her as he opened the lid, and she would be subjected to his depraved and unpredictable rituals of torture, abuse, and degradation. He controlled every facet of her existence with the dispassionate authority of a laboratory scientist observing a specimen. He dictated when she ate, if she ate at all, when she was permitted to use a primitive toilet bucket, and when she was allowed to stretch her cramping, agonized limbs. Her body was no longer her own. It was his property, an object for his twisted fantasies, a canvas for his cruelty. Life inside the box was an agonizingly slow process of being buried alive. She lay cramped and contorted, her muscles seizing and atrophying, her skin growing raw and ulcerated from the constant friction against the rough, unfinished wood. The air was stale and thick with the smell of her own unwashed body, and the silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, panicked drumming of her heart. In this state of total and prolonged sensory deprivation, the human mind begins to break down, to fray at the edges. The carefully constructed lines between reality and nightmare blur and then dissolve completely. To survive, to keep from descending into a final, irretrievable madness, Colleen had to retreat deep within the fortress of her own mind. She discovered she could escape, not physically, but mentally. She journeyed into her memories, replaying every happy moment of her life with the intense focus of a devout worshiper. She meticulously reconstructed her childhood home, room by room, remembering the pattern on the wallpaper, the feel of the carpet under her feet. She relived days at the beach, feeling the phantom warmth of the sun on her skin and hearing the spectral crash of the waves. She conjured the faces of her family and friends, speaking to them in her mind, holding onto their love as her only source of light in the endless dark. These memories were more than just pleasant distractions. They were a lifeline, her only link to the person she had once been, the only proof that the world outside the box still existed. The psychological conditioning, however, was as relentless and real as the physical confinement. Cameron Hooker worked tirelessly to reinforce the elaborate fiction of the company, the cornerstone of his control. This was his masterpiece of manipulation. He created a complex mythology for this sinister organization, telling her they were a secret society with ancient roots, a powerful cabal that collected and trained slaves for the world's elite. He would bring her updates and evaluations from his supposed superiors, showing her official-looking binders filled with typed pages of draconian rules, regulations, and punishments. He even fabricated a laminated slave license bearing her photograph, a grotesque parody of a driver's license that listed her as his property. He convinced her that the company was omniscient and omnipresent. They were watching her family, her friends, every moment of every day. He described in gruesome, vivid detail the unspeakable things the company would do to her parents and sister if she ever disobeyed, ever faltered in her role, or ever attempted to escape. This constant, looming threat became the true cornerstone of her captivity. The physical locks on the coffin box were strong, but the psychological chains he forged around her heart and mind were infinitely stronger. The absolute terror she felt for her family's safety was the invisible, electrified fence that kept her from even daring to dream of running. She learned to live on the razor's edge of his moods, to anticipate his desires, to do everything she could to avoid his unpredictable wrath. Absolute obedience became her only survival strategy. She did everything she was told, no matter how degrading, bizarre, or painful. To endure this, she forced herself to become what he wanted her to be. Kay, his willing slave. The creation of Kay was a desperate act of psychological schism, a way to partition her own identity. It was the only way Colleen could endure the unrelenting trauma without her core self shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Colleen Stan was the girl who loved horseback riding and cherished her family. Kay was the compliant shell, the automaton who absorbed the pain, who obeyed without question, whose only purpose was to keep Colleen alive. She suppressed her own personality, her own thoughts, her own will, burying them deep beneath this horrifying facade. She became a ghost in her own life, her physical body present in the dark basement, while her conscious mind floated in the safe harbor of her past. In the suffocating darkness of her coffin box, trapped between the beautiful, painful memories of a life she had lost and the abject terror of a present she could not escape, Colleen Stan began her long, silent, and solitary war for survival. To understand the 7 years of darkness that Colleen Stan endured, one must look beyond the physical confines of the box and into the twisted psychological landscape of the two people who held her captive. Cameron and Janice Hooker were not a simple duo of criminals. They were a complex, toxic ecosystem of control, fear, and shared depravity. Their relationship was the engine that powered Colleen's torment, a horrifying partnership that made escape seem not just impossible, but unthinkable. Cameron Hooker was the architect of the nightmare. To the outside world in Red Bluff, California, he was utterly unremarkable. He worked a steady job at a local lumber mill, was a husband and a father, and appeared to be just another quiet resident of their sleepy suburban street. This very normalcy was his most effective camouflage. It concealed a mind that had been cultivating monstrous fantasies for years. Cameron was not an impulsive predator who seized a random opportunity. He was a meticulous planner, a patient artist of cruelty. Long before he ever met Colleen Stan, he was already building his instruments of torture. The infamous box was not a spur-of-the-moment creation. It was the culmination of a long-held dream. A dream of owning another human being completely. His inner world was a cesspool of violent, misogynistic pornography and sadistic literature, which he consumed voraciously. These materials were not just entertainment, they were his textbooks, his blueprints for how to deconstruct a person's will. He was intelligent, but his intelligence was cunning and predatory, entirely dedicated to manipulation and control. He possessed no empathy to Cameron. Other people, including his own wife and children, were not fellow human beings. They were objects, tools to be used for his gratification. He saw himself as a master, a superior being entitled to exert absolute power over others. The creation of the company was the ultimate expression of his megalomania, a fictional organization that allowed him to play God, to invent a universe where his every sick whim was law. And then there was Janice. If Cameron was the architect of the prison, Janice was its reluctant, terrified, and deeply conflicted warden. Her role in this story is one of the most disturbing and complex aspects of the case. When she met Cameron, she was a shy, insecure teenager. He was older, more experienced, and he quickly became the center of her world. From the very beginning, he was grooming her, isolating her from her family and friends, and establishing a pattern of control and abuse. She was his first victim. He subjected her to his own brand of psychological and physical torment, breaking her down long before Colleen ever entered their lives. He convinced her that she was worthless without him, that she was lucky to have him. When Cameron first revealed his fantasy of capturing a slave, Janice was horrified. But by then she was already trapped in his web. She was terrified of him, terrified of what he would do to her if she refused. He presented it not as a choice, but as an inevitability. Her participation was a condition of her own survival. And so, when their blue van pulled over for Colleen Stan, Janice sat silently in the passenger seat, a hostage forced to help take another. Her silence was not consent. It was the paralysis of terror. The dynamic within the Hooker home became a triangular prison of fear. Cameron sat at the apex, the absolute dictator. Below him were his two captives, Colleen, the official slave in the box, and Janice, the slave who was allowed to walk freely through the house. He expertly pitted the two women against each other, using each one as a tool to control the other. He would use Janice's presence to reinforce Colleen's helplessness, pointing to her as an example of a woman who understood and accepted her place. He would then use Colleen's presence to terrorize Janice, a constant living reminder of what he was capable of and what could happen to her if she ever defied him. The atmosphere in the house was a suffocating blend of mundane domesticity and unspeakable horror. On the surface, they performed the rituals of a normal family. Janice would cook meals, they would raise their two children, and on Sundays, Cameron would insist they all go to church. He would sit in the pew, a Bible in his lap, the very picture of a righteous family man, while just a few feet below them, in the dark earth beneath the house, Colleen lay locked in her box. This grotesque facade was perhaps the most insane aspect of the ordeal. It was a constant, dizzying reminder to Colleen that the world of normal life was happening just inches away, yet it was a universe she could not reach. For Janice, her role was a constant, soul-crushing torment. She was forced to participate in Colleen's abuse, to be a witness to atrocities that scarred her conscience. Yet, there were moments when her shared victimhood with Colleen created a fragile, unspoken bond. On rare occasions when Cameron was away, Janice might grant Colleen a small kindness, a bit of extra food, a moment out of the box, a whispered word that wasn't in order. These were dangerous and fleeting acts of rebellion, but for Colleen, they were glimmers of light in an endless tunnel of darkness. They were also profoundly confusing. Was Janice her enemy or a fellow prisoner? This ambiguity was another layer of Cameron's control, keeping Colleen off balance, unable to form a clear picture of her situation, further cementing her dependence on her captor. As the years wore on, the psychological toll on Janice became immense. The guilt, the fear, and the horror of her daily existence began to eat away at her, setting the stage for the eventual collapse of their monstrous world. For years, survival had been Colleen Stan's only goal, a state of passive endurance in the face of unimaginable horror. Her existence was a cycle of darkness, pain, and the systematic dismantling of her identity. But the human spirit, even when stretched to its absolute breaking point, possesses a remarkable and often mysterious capacity for resilience. After years of being Kay, the compliant slave, something began to shift within the suffocating confines of the hooker house. It was not a loud, dramatic rebellion, but a quiet, internal resistance. A slow, patient reclamation of the self that Cameron Hooker had tried so hard to murder. The catalyst for this change was, paradoxically, an act of supreme arrogance on Cameron's part. After approximately 3 years of near-continuous confinement in the box, he came to believe that his psychological conditioning was complete. In his twisted, megalomaniacal mind, he had succeeded. He had broken Colleen Stan and created Kay, a perfect, obedient slave who no longer required constant physical restraint. He decided it was time to test his creation. He began to let her out of the box for longer periods, not out of kindness, but as a demonstration of his absolute power. He started to integrate her into the daily life of the family, transitioning her from a secret in the basement to a ghost in the house. This new reality was profoundly surreal. Colleen was given a new role. She became the live-in nanny for the Hooker's 2 young children. She cooked their meals, washed their clothes, helped them with their homework, and tucked them into bed at night. To anyone peering through a window, she would have looked like a part of the family. But this was no ordinary life. She was still a prisoner. Every night she was returned to her coffin box in the basement. Every moment of her day was spent under the constant, menacing watch of Cameron, and the threat of the mythical company loomed over every action. She was allowed to feel the sun on her skin, but she was not free. She was allowed to speak, but only the words he permitted. It was a more complex and in some ways more psychologically torturous form of imprisonment. However, this increased exposure to the world, however controlled, began to have an unintended effect. It started to slowly reawaken the parts of Colleen that had gone dormant. The simple act of caring for children proved to be a powerful antidote to Cameron's poison. The affection she felt for them and the innocent love they showed her in return reconnected her to her own humanity. In her role as their protector and caregiver, she found a sense of purpose that existed outside of her identity as a slave. These children depended on her, and that simple fact began to rebuild the foundations of her self-worth. Hearing the sounds of a normal neighborhood, dogs barking, ice cream trucks, children laughing, pierced the psychological armor of Kay and began to reach the real Colleen buried deep beneath. With this faint, returning sense of self came the beginning of her quiet resistance. These were not grand acts of defiance. Any overt rebellion would have been met with swift and brutal punishment. Instead, her war was fought in the small, secret spaces of her own mind and in almost imperceptible actions. It was a campaign of tiny, internal victories. She continued her practice of retreating into her memories, but now it wasn't just a desperate escape mechanism. It became a conscious act of defiance. She would purposefully hold onto her identity as Colleen Stan, daughter of Jack and Mary, sister of Bonnie. She would mentally scream her own name in the silence of the box, refusing to let Kay consume her completely. Her small rebellions grew bolder. She discovered a passion for jogging and convinced Cameron that it was part of her slave training, a way to maintain her physical fitness for the company. He agreed, and she was allowed to run on the quiet country roads near the house. These runs became her sacred moments of freedom. With the wind in her hair and the earth beneath her feet, she was not Kay. She was a runner. She was herself. During these runs, away from his immediate physical presence, she would allow herself to dream, to think thoughts that were her own, planting the seeds for a future she couldn't yet imagine. The most significant and audacious test of Cameron's control came in 1981. In an act of stunning psychological audacity, he decided to allow Colleen to visit her family for her sister's wedding. This was to be his ultimate triumph. He drove her to her family's home, reminding her that he and the company would be watching her every move, that any misstep would result in the immediate and gruesome slaughter of everyone she loved. He dropped her off on their doorstep and left. The reunion was a scene of agonizing, unspoken tension. Her family was overjoyed to see her alive, but they were also deeply unsettled. The daughter and sister they remembered was gone. In her place was a gaunt, quiet woman who spoke in a strange, robotic monotone. She dutifully parroted the lies Cameron had forced her to rehearse, telling them that she had been living happily in a commune with her boyfriend and his friends, and that she couldn't give them a phone number or address because they lived off the grid. She brought them gifts, strange leather items she had been forced to make as proof of her new life. Her family, desperate to believe she was okay, accepted her story, but a deep sense of wrongness hung in the air. They could see the terror in her eyes, but they couldn't understand its source. For Colleen, the visit was the purest form of torture. She was home. She was in her old room, surrounded by the ghosts of her happy childhood. She was with the people she loved more than anything in the world, the very people whose lives she was trying to protect. Every fiber of her being screamed to tell them the truth, to beg for help. But the fear Cameron had instilled in her was a physical gag in her throat. She could not speak. The risk was too great. She spent the entire visit in a state of excruciating internal conflict, a silent scream trapped behind a practiced, placid smile. After a few days, she did the unthinkable. She returned, willingly, to her captor. Her father drove her to the bus station and she went back to Red Bluff, back to the box. To Cameron, this was his final victory. He had proven that his psychological control was absolute. She had been given the chance to be free, and she had chosen to return to her cage. But for Colleen, something profound and irreversible had shifted. The visit, which was meant to be the final lock on her cage, had ironically become the first key to her eventual escape. Seeing her family, being in the real world, had planted a powerful seed of doubt. The fantasy of the company began to feel slightly less real when contrasted with the tangible love of her family. The line between Cameron's fiction and the world's reality had become, for the first time, sharp and clear. Her quiet resistance was no longer just about internal survival. It had found an external anchor. The embers of hope, long dormant, had been fanned into a tiny, flickering flame. The embers of hope that had been fanned during Colleen's visit home were fragile, but they refused to be extinguished. Back in the suffocating routine of the Hooker household, she clung to the memory of her family, a secret anchor in the turbulent sea of her captivity. But the final dramatic collapse of Cameron Hooker's monstrous world would not be initiated by Colleen. It would come from the most unlikely of sources: his own wife, Janice. For years, Janice had been a tormented co-conspirator, a prisoner forced to act as a warden, but the immense weight of her guilt, combined with her own simmering terror, was slowly pushing her toward a breaking point. Two powerful forces were at work on Janice's conscience. The first was a burgeoning religious faith. Seeking some form of solace, she had begun attending church more fervently. The teachings of sin, redemption, and moral accountability began to clash violently with the horrific reality of her daily life. She started to see the profound evil of what her husband was doing, not just as a crime, but as a stain upon her soul. The second and more immediate catalyst was Cameron himself. His appetites were not satisfied with one slave. He began to talk openly of finding another, younger girl to add to their collection. This threat horrified Janice, but it was his chilling suggestion that he might one day initiate their own daughters into his depraved lifestyle that finally shattered her complicity. The instinct to protect her children overrode the fear she had of her husband. In the summer of 1984, shaking with a terror that had been building for nearly a decade, Janice took a monumental step. She went to the pastor of her church, and in a flood of agonized tears, she confessed everything. She told him about the kidnapping, about the box, about the torture, about the company. The pastor, stunned and horrified, listened to her story and gave her the one piece of advice that would change everything. He told her that God would forgive her, but only if she did everything in her power to free Colleen and bring Cameron to justice. This confession was the breaking of the dam. Armed with a newfound sense of moral clarity, Janice's role in the house began to fundamentally shift. She was no longer just a fellow victim. She was a secret agent of liberation, working from within the enemy's camp. The final, crucial step was to dismantle the psychological prison that held Colleen captive. One day, when Cameron was at work, Janice went to Colleen. Her voice trembling, she looked her directly in the eye and uttered the words that would finally shatter the 7-year-long spell. "There is no company. It's all a lie. It's just him. It's always been just him." Before Colleen, this revelation was a seismic shock, an explosion in her mind. The entire foundation of her reality, the intricate web of fear that had dictated her every move for 7 years, crumbled to dust in an instant. The initial disbelief was quickly replaced by a dawning, terrifying wave of understanding. The years of servitude, the missed chances to escape, the agonizing visit with her family, it had all been based on a fiction spun by one pathetic, cruel man. The psychological cage had been vaporized. All that remained were the physical walls of the house, and now, for the first time, she had an ally on the inside. The escape was planned in frantic, whispered conversations, fraught with the terror of being discovered. The plan was simple and desperate. On a morning in August 1984, while Cameron was at work, Janice drove Colleen to a nearby bus station. She pressed some cash into Colleen's hand, money she had secretly saved. She told her to get on a bus, to call her parents, and to never, ever look back. The two women, bound by a trauma that no one else on earth could ever understand, shared a final, tearful look. Then, Colleen Stan, after 2,643 days in hell, walked away. She got on the bus, and as it pulled away from the station, the familiar landscape of Red Bluff receding behind her, she began the long journey from the dark world of K back into the light of her own life. The bus ride home was a surreal passage between realities. Hours earlier, she had been a slave. Now, she was just a woman on a bus, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives. When she finally arrived and called her family, their joy was explosive, but it was immediately tempered by confusion and shock as the truth of her ordeal began to tumble out. The commune story dissolved, replaced by a horrifying narrative of a box, a contract, and a monster named Cameron Hooker. The aftermath was not a simple, happy ending. Freedom, for Colleen, was terrifying. She was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. For months, she was crippled by agoraphobia, too terrified to leave her parents' home. The world she had dreamed of rejoining now seemed loud, overwhelming, and filled with potential threats. The psychological chains, though broken, had left deep phantom grooves. The fear that Cameron might somehow find her, that his reach was longer than she knew, haunted her waking hours and her dreams. For months, she was too paralyzed by this fear to go to the police. The final push for justice came, once again, from Janice Hooker. Terrified that Cameron would discover her role in the escape and kill her, she went to the police. In exchange for full immunity from prosecution, she gave a complete, detailed confession, corroborating every horrific detail of Colleen's story. With Janice's testimony secured, the police finally had the evidence they needed. They arrested Cameron Hooker, a quiet family man from a quiet street, and the shocking story of the girl in the box was revealed to a stunned public. The trial was a media sensation. Cameron's defense attorneys attempted to portray Colleen not as a victim, but as a willing participant in a bizarre, consensual BDSM relationship, a desperate and cruel tactic to discredit her. But the power of her testimony was undeniable. On the stand, Colleen, no longer the terrified Kay, recounted her 7 years of torment with a quiet dignity that captivated and horrified the courtroom. When Janice took the stand after her testimony sealed Cameron's fate. In the end, Cameron Hooker was convicted of kidnapping, torture, and a host of other charges. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison, ensuring he would never again be free to harm another soul. For Colleen, the verdict was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a lifelong process of healing. Reclaiming her life has been a long, arduous road, marked by years of therapy and a daily struggle against the echoes of her trauma. But she has survived. She has gone on to become an advocate for other victims, using her story not as a source of shame, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She has rebuilt a life, found love, and learned to live with the scars of her past, a powerful, living symbol of a woman who was buried in darkness but refused to let her light be extinguished. The story of Colleen Stan is a harrowing journey into the depths of human cruelty, but it is also an undeniable testament to the power of the human spirit to endure and overcome. It reminds us that evil can wear the most ordinary of faces, and that courage can be found in the most silent, desperate moments. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more of the hidden histories and psychological dramas that define our world, please subscribe to Dark Chapters. Click the bell icon so you don't miss our next investigation into the shadows.